I remember the day I arrived at Pinegrove University like it was yesterday, the sprawling campus awash in the golden hue of an autumn afternoon. The air was crisp, filled with the promise of new beginnings and the faint, lingering scent of pine from the surrounding forests. It was my sanctuary, a place where I hoped to bury myself in the annals of history, unearthing secrets long forgotten. Little did I know, the greatest mystery I would encounter lay not in the dusty pages of an ancient manuscript, but in the very heart of the university itself. Professor Vincent Marlowe was a legend at Pinegrove, his name synonymous with the Department of History. From the first lecture I attended, I was captivated. His voice had a way of transporting you through time, from the battlefields of ancient empires to the courts of medieval kings. Yet, it wasn't just his words that held me spellbound. It was the inexplicable feeling that he had witnessed it all firsthand. As the weeks passed, my fascination with Marlowe grew into an obsession. I noticed how he seemed to avoid the daylight, his office windows perpetually shaded, his presence in the corridors always fleeting, like a shadow at dusk. His knowledge was uncanny, too detailed, too vivid, as if he were recounting personal memories rather than historical facts. Driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, I began to seek out more about him. The more I learned, the more questions I had. Whispers among the older students hinted at a mysterious past, rumors that Marlowe had been at Pinegrove far longer than any professor should. It was absurd, of course, but in the quiet of the library, surrounded by the weight of history, I couldn't help but wonder. One evening, driven by a restless curiosity, I decided to delve deeper. The library of Pinegrove was a vast, labyrinthine collection of knowledge, its oldest sections rarely disturbed by the modern student. It was there, in the dim light of a flickering lamp, that I found the first clue, a photograph, yellowed with age, buried in a forgotten file. The image was of the university faculty, dated 1895. There, among the stern faces of scholars long dead, was Marlowe, unchanged, unaged. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the photograph. It was impossible, and yet the evidence was undeniable. My gaze was drawn back to the image, to Marlowe's eyes. Even in black and white, they seemed to possess a depth, a knowledge that went beyond the mere academic. I knew then that my life at Pinegrove University would never be the same. The shadows that had once seemed benign now whispered secrets, and every corner seemed to conceal truths too dark for the light of day. I was standing on the threshold of a mystery that defied explanation, and I could not turn back. The revelation that night in the library had opened a door I could never close, casting long shadows over the life I once knew at Pinegrove University. Sleep became elusive, my nights spent poring over records and ancient texts, searching for any trace of Vincent Marlowe's past. The photograph from 1895 was just the beginning, a single thread in a tapestry of mystery that I was determined to unravel. As the semester progressed, my academic pursuits took a back seat to my investigation into Marlowe. I could see the concern in my friends' eyes, their hesitant questions about my well-being met with distracted assurances. I knew they couldn't understand, couldn't see the depth of the enigma that had ensnared me. To them, Marlowe was just a professor, albeit a peculiar one. To me, he had become an obsession, a puzzle that defied all logic. One chilly October evening, I decided it was time to share my discoveries. I invited my closest friend Sarah to my dorm under the guise of studying for an upcoming exam. The truth, however, was far from academic. I laid out the photograph, along with other documents I had found, evidence that suggested Marlowe's presence at Pinegrove stretched back over a century. Sarah's reaction was a mix of skepticism and concern. "Ethan, this is insane," she said, her voice tinged with fear. "Even if he does look like Marlowe, it doesn't mean anything. It could be a relative or just a coincidence. But I could see the doubt in her eyes, the unwillingness to believe what lay before her. I pressed on, outlining my theories, my belief that Marlowe was not merely a man, but something else, something timeless. The conversation ended with an argument, Sarah pleading with me to let it go, to focus on my studies and forget about Marlowe. But I wouldn't let it go. The mystery had consumed me, and I felt as though I was on the verge of a breakthrough. It was late when Sarah left, the campus shrouded in fog, the night air filled with the scent of impending rain. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The need to confront Marlowe, to demand answers, was overwhelming. I knew the risks, knew that delving too deep into the unknown could have consequences I couldn't foresee. Yet the truth beckoned, a siren call that I was powerless to resist. The decision was made in the quiet hours of the morning, a resolve forming amidst the shadows of doubt. I would confront Marlowe, lay bare the evidence I had gathered, and demand the truth. It was a dangerous game, I knew, but the need for answers outweighed the fear of what I might discover. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the curtains of my dorm room, I prepared myself for what was to come. The day ahead promised revelations, the unveiling of secrets that had lingered in the dark for far too long. I was ready, or so I thought, to face the unknown. The stillness of the early morning campus felt like the calm before a storm as I made my way to Professor Marlowe's office, the documents I had uncovered shaking in my hands. My heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination. Today, I would confront him with what I had found. Knocking on the door to his office, I barely managed to compose myself as it swung open. Marlowe stood there, an imposing figure backlit by the dim glow of antique lamps. "Ah, Mr. Hawthorne, what an unexpected pleasure," he intoned, his voice smooth and untroubled. "Please, come in." Once inside, I hesitated, then laid the evidence on his desk. His eyes flicked over the documents briefly before meeting mine again. "I think you know what this is about," I began, my voice betraying the tension I felt. Marlowe leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Why don't you enlighten me?" he prompted, a trace of amusement in his voice. You've been here too long. The same age for centuries," I stammered, the weight of the accusation hanging awkwardly in the air between us. Marlowe's expression turned contemplative, his gaze piercing. "And what conclusion have you drawn from this observation?" he asked, his curiosity seemingly piqued. "That you're not human, that you're a vampire," I said, the words feeling surreal even as they left my lips. To my surprise, Marlowe didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded, a grave look on his face. "Indeed, Mr. Hawthorne, I am as you say. I had hoped to keep my true nature concealed, but it seems you have seen through my charade." I was taken aback by his admission, my mind racing to process the revelation. "But why? Why stay here at the university?" Marlowe sighed, the sound carrying a weight of centuries. "This place, these halls of knowledge, they are my sanctuary from the world outside, a world that would not understand or accept what I am. Here, I can blend in, immerse myself in the pursuit of knowledge, and yes, feed when necessary, with discretion." The casual admission of feeding sent a shiver down my spine. "You kill people?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not people, Mr. Hawthorne. I feed on those who would not be missed, those whose society has already abandoned. I take no pleasure in it. It is merely survival." His justification did little to assuage my horror. "But how can you justify that? How can you live with yourself?" Marlowe's gaze met mine, intense and unyielding. "When you have lived as long as I have, Mr. Hawthorne, you will understand that survival comes at a cost. One must make choices, difficult and often unsavory, to continue existing. The enormity of what he was suggesting of the life he led was overwhelming. "What are you going to do with me?" I asked, the fear of becoming his next victim suddenly very real. Marlowe stood, and for a moment I thought to flee, but his next word stopped me. "I have no desire to harm you, Ethan, but I cannot allow my secret to be exposed. You will leave here and you will forget what you have learned. If you speak of this to anyone, I will know." As I left his office, the morning sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the campus. I felt a profound sense of unease, the encounter leaving me with more questions than answers. Marlowe's confession had painted a complex picture, one of survival at any cost. But could such a creature truly justify his existence? Or was I merely the latest pawn in his centuries-old game? The encounter had changed something fundamental within me. The world seemed a darker place, filled with secrets and horrors I had once thought relegated to fiction. Marlowe's final warning echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows. I knew then that my life could never return to normal. The knowledge I possessed was a heavy burden, one that I would carry with me, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if today would be the day my silence would be broken. The aftermath of my confrontation with Professor Marlowe left me adrift in a sea of turmoil. The truth about him, confirmed in his own words, was a specter that haunted my every moment. The notion that I could simply walk away and forget was unthinkable. How could I, in good conscience, ignore the dark reality of his existence, knowing the danger he posed? My decision to act crystallized in the silence of my room, amidst the scattered notes and books that spoke of a life once consumed by academic pursuits. Now they seemed trivial, inconsequential in the face of the monstrous truth hidden within Pinegrove University. I began to plan, knowing that any attempt to expose Marlowe would be fraught with peril. My initial thoughts turned to gathering incontrovertible proof of his vampirism, but the memory of his warning stayed my hand. To confront Marlowe directly would be to invite disaster. Instead, I sought allies, those who would believe the unbelievable, who could help me bring Marlowe to justice. The first person who came to mind was Dr. Simmons, a professor of folklore and mythology. If anyone on campus would entertain the possibility of a vampire masquerading as a professor, it would be her. I arranged to meet with her under the guise of discussing my thesis, a pretense that felt increasingly hollow as the true weight of my purpose loomed large. Sitting across from Dr. Simmons in her office, surrounded by books on every conceivable aspect of the supernatural, I broached the subject cautiously. "Have you ever considered the possibility of vampires being more than just myth?" I ventured, watching her reaction closely. Dr. Simmons regarded me with a keen interest, her eyes sharpening. "Vampires, Mr. Hawthorne? That's quite a leap from your usual topics of interest. What brings this about?" I hesitated, the risk of sounding mad or, worse, drawing Marlowe's attention, weighing heavily on me. Yet, the urgency of the situation compelled me to continue. "What if I told you that I have reason to believe that one walks among us here at Pinegrove?" The skepticism I had braced for never came. Instead, Dr. Simmons leaned forward, her expression serious. "Go on," she urged. Emboldened, I shared everything, from my initial suspicions to the damning confrontation with Marlowe. Dr. Simmons listened intently, her expression one of thoughtful consideration rather than disbelief. "This is a grave accusation, Ethan," she said after a moment of silence, "but not one I'm inclined to dismiss outright. The evidence you've presented, coupled with your experiences, warrants investigation. However, we must proceed with caution." With Dr. Simmons' support, a plan began to take shape. We would gather evidence of Marlowe's activities, documenting his movements and any proof of his supernatural nature. Armed with this information, we would then approach the university administration and, if necessary, the authorities. The task was daunting, and the danger real. Marlowe was no mere academic, but a predator, cunning, and centuries old. Yet, the thought of those who might fall victim to his thirst if I did nothing spurred me on. As I left Dr. Simmons' office, a mix of fear and determination settled over me. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but the decision to stand against the darkness was one I could not turn away from. Marlowe's reign of terror at Pinegrove University would end, and I, along with Dr. Simmons, would be the ones to end it. The task of gathering evidence against Professor Marlowe was akin to navigating a minefield in the dark. Every step, every inquiry, carried the risk of detonating the precarious balance of secrecy and safety I had managed to maintain since our confrontation. Yet, driven by a resolve that bordered on obsession, I pressed forward, with Dr. Simmons as my sole confidant and ally in this clandestine endeavor. Our plan was simple in theory, but complex in execution. We would monitor Marlowe's movements, documenting any peculiar behavior or proof of his preternatural nature, all while maintaining the utmost discretion to avoid arousing his suspicion. However, the reality of spying on a creature as old and cunning as Marlowe proved to be a challenge of monumental proportions. The first hurdle was Marlowe's seemingly erratic schedule. His classes and office hours provided a veneer of normalcy, but his movements outside of these predictable patterns were erratic and untraceable. More than once, I found myself lurking in the shadows of the university's ancient buildings, watching as Marlowe departed into the night, his destination unknown and his purpose inscrutable. On one such evening, my vigil near Marlowe's office took a harrowing turn. Hidden behind the gnarled branches of an old oak, I watched as Marlowe emerged, his steps silent and purposeful. Compelled by a mix of fear and determination, I followed, keeping to the shadows as we wound our way through the dimly lit campus. The chase led me to the edge of the university grounds, where the manicured lawns gave way to the dense forest that bordered Pinegrove. Here, the darkness was complete, the canopy of ancient trees blotting out the moon's pale light. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, yet I pressed on, driven by the need for answers. It was then that the forest came alive with sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, the sensation of being watched from the shadows. Panic gripped me, a visceral fear that I was not alone, that Marlowe had led me into a trap. And suddenly, he was there, emerging from the darkness like a specter. "Mr. Hawthorne," Marlowe's voice was a whisper in the night, "your curiosity will be the death of you." I froze, my heart thundering in my chest as I faced him. The realization that I had been outmaneuvered, that my pursuit had played right into his hands, was a bitter pill. "What do you want?" I managed to say, my voice steady despite the fear. "A demonstration," he replied, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, "of what it means to be what I am." Before I could react, Marlowe moved, not towards me, but past, his form blurring with a speed that defied nature. The sound that followed, a sharp, desperate cry, chilled me to the bone. And then, silence. When he returned, his visage was serene, as if the display of predatory prowess had been nothing out of the ordinary. "Let this be a lesson to you, Mr. Hawthorne. There are things in this world far more dangerous than your wildest imaginings." The threat was clear, and the message unmistakable. My efforts to expose him had placed me in grave danger, a pawn in a game played by a creature whose rules I could barely comprehend. The walk back to the safety of the university grounds was a blur, my mind reeling from the encounter. The challenge of gathering evidence against Marlowe was no longer just an academic pursuit, it was a survival game. And as I lay awake that night, replaying the events in the forest, I realized the true depth of the darkness I was up against. Marlowe was not just a vampire. He was a warning of the price of delving too deep into the shadows. Under the cloak of an ominous night, Dr. Simmons and I approached Professor Marlowe's office, the air thick with the foreboding sense that this encounter would be our final act of defiance. The university around us lay in a deceptive peace, its ivy-clad buildings silent witnesses to the impending confrontation. Marlowe awaited us, his office dimly lit, shadows lurking in the corners like silent spectators. "Ah, the heralds of my reckoning," he greeted us with a sardonic smile, his demeanor one of amusement rather than threat. "Do come in." The door shut behind us with a click that sounded too much like the ceiling of a tomb. "This ends tonight, Marlowe," I declared, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. Beside me, Dr. Simmons nodded, her resolve a tangible thing in the charged atmosphere. Marlowe laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Your courage is commendable, but misplaced. You seek to end centuries with mere words and convictions." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows darker, as Marlowe advanced towards us. His movements were graceful, predatory, a lion among lambs. "Let me show you the folly of your quest," he whispered, his voice a chilling caress. Before we could react, Marlowe was upon us. His speed was otherworldly, his form a blur as he struck. Dr. Simmons gasped, a sound cut abruptly short as Marlowe's attention turned to me, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for a way out, but it was too late. Marlowe closed the distance between us in an instant, his presence engulfing me. I could see him clearly now, the monster beneath the veneer of academia, the ancient predator masquerading as a man. His hands were on me, cold and unyielding, tilting my head to expose my neck. I could feel his breath, icy against my skin, as he whispered, "Your pursuit of truth ends here, in the embrace of the night." I was powerless, frozen by fear and the unnerving realization of my imminent death. Marlowe's mouth opened, revealing fangs that gleamed in the dim light, sharp and deadly. The last thing I felt was the piercing pain of those fangs sinking into my flesh, a pain that quickly gave way to an icy numbness. The world around me dimmed, my senses dulled by the venom coursing through my veins. I could feel my lifeblood being drawn out, a vital warmth ebbing away into the cold embrace of my predator. In those final moments, my thoughts were not of fear or regret, but of a profound sorrow for the darkness that lay hidden within our world, a darkness that consumed all light, all hope. Marlowe's voice was the last thing I heard, a mere whisper in the growing void. "Sleep now, in the eternal night." As darkness claimed me, the last vestige of consciousness slipping away, I realized that our story would not be a tale of victory over darkness, but a cautionary whisper lost in the shadow of eternal night. And so, under the watchful gaze of a silent university, Ethan and Dr. Simmons became but memories, their final stand against the darkness a testament to their courage and their folly. The night reclaimed its own, and Professor Marlowe, the undying guardian of its secrets, continued his eternal vigil, a predator hidden in plain sight. Thank you for journeying with us through the shadows of Pinegrove University, where truth and terror walk hand in hand. If the chilling tale of Ethan, Dr. Simmons, and the enigmatic Professor Marlowe has captivated you, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement helps us bring more dark tales from the corners of the unknown into the light. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to ensure you never miss out on our next descent into mystery and horror. Until our paths cross again in the dim corridors of another story, keep the lights on and the night at bay.